Buenas tardes y bienvenidos a todos. I am Valeria Praga-Rodríguez, COCABE board member and your host for tonight's webinar. We're excited to have you here for the 4th edition of our Si Se Puede webinar series. At COCABE, we continue to work hard to provide professional development opportunities for bilingual teachers. The focus of tonight's webinar is dual language instruction across in-person and remote settings, and will be presented by our dear colleague, Heather LaMont. I will introduce her shortly. Please know that all our webinar sessions are recorded and can be found on our website within 2 weeks after the live webinar. Great. So we are going to be trying a new format today. We will have the 60-minute live webinar, and following right after the webinar, we will have a late cafe. During that time, teachers and participants will have an opportunity to go over the concepts presented during the webinar, and will be a more informal space where you can collaborate with other colleagues about the issues that we're going to be presenting today. Also, something new that we are offering today is that participants who choose to attend both the webinar and the late cafe are eligible for a certificate of completion for 2.5 hours towards license renewal. So if you haven't registered for the whole workshop, we're calling the webinar plus the cafe a workshop. If you haven't registered yet, you can still do that later today. You must be registered and pay a $10 processing fee in order to receive the certificate of completion. We will have the chat going at all times, and please feel free to comment and ask questions in English or in Spanish. All of us presenting and handling the chat speak English and Spanish, so please communicate however you feel most comfortable. As usual for our webinars, we have a note catcher that you have access to. You should be receiving the link to open the note catcher in the chat box. In this note catcher, you can take notes as we go through all the topics of our presentation, and also you will find links to all the resources that Heather will be presenting today. So it's up to you if you would like to have it open and check it out later, or if you want to take notes as Heather presents. One of the links that you will find is a link to submit a proposal for our conference. We're really excited to announce that we will have a virtual conference. Our COCABE conference for 2021 will be 100% virtual, and we are accepting proposals. So if you have developed a professional learning session that you would like to share with colleagues across the state of Colorado and the country, please consider submitting a proposal. We're accepting proposals right now. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to my dear colleague and friend, Heather LaMont. Heather has been in education for the past 18 years. She got her master's degree in elementary education from the University of St. Thomas in Minneapolis. And she describes herself as a sequential bilingual who really enjoys traveling and being in touch with diverse cultures around the world. Her 13 years of experience in bilingual classrooms at both the elementary and the secondary level have been in Guatemala, Minneapolis, Chicago, and Denver. Heather has been in her current role as dual language program manager in DPS's, Denver Public Schools Department, Multilingual Education Department, for the last 5 years, where she supports all dual language schools from ground zero, and then she oversees the programs and supports administrators, teachers, and families. It's our honor to have you here with us, Heather. Thank you so much, and the stage is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. I had to figure out where my mute was, unmute was, since it's not in the bottom when you're presenting. Anyway, thank you so much, Valeria. Those were all very nice things that you said about me. And I want to say thank you to everyone for spending your late afternoon, early evening with us on a Thursday. We very much appreciate it. So I'm going to take us through talking about what dual language instruction can look like in both in-person and remote settings, or if you are live streaming, we can talk about that too. But I really do want to say that even in the best of years, under the best of circumstances, teaching in a dual language program is hard. And it's always a constant balancing act between teaching content and teaching language, and trying to figure out where students are in terms of their understanding. And is it language? Is it content? What is it? And this year has been especially hard for those of us who are doing it in a remote setting, in an in-person setting, in a live streaming setting. So my hope is that through this presentation, what you will leave with are some strategies that will help you bridge what you've always done and think about it in a slightly different way based on your particular situation. Because even if you're in person right now, it's not like a normal in-person setting. So the hope is that you'll walk away with some strategies that will help you. So here's our goal for tonight. We basically will look at some strategies for supporting students in dual language, whether that's in person, remote, or all of the above. And whether your classroom looks like the one on the top, where the kids are all sitting in rows and wearing their masks and doing their absolute best to pay attention to the teacher who's 6 feet away from them, or you're on the picture in the bottom where all of your students are looking at you through their screens, or you're doing both of those things at the same time. The hope is that you leave here with some steps that will help you in the coming weeks and months in your dual language classroom. So here's our agenda for our time together today. We're going to start with just some common understanding around dual language programming. If any of you also work in immersion settings where the majority of your students are English speakers, this will work for you as well. Then we'll move on to talking about strategies that you can use in your classroom. And we will finish up with how to support families in this very challenging time. So just as a reminder, these are the non-negotiables for dual language education at the elementary level. A minimum of 50% of instruction is in the partner language. In DPS, the only dual language programs we have are Spanish and English. So 50% Spanish minimum to a maximum of 90%. We have had some changes in our thinking around separation of languages for instruction, and now that is really focused on the teacher staying in the language of instruction for students in order for them to learn the most from it. And if possible, a K-12 commitment from your district, if not a minimum of K-5, so that students have the full range and full number of years they need in order to work towards being bilingual and biliterate. So let's take just 1 minute or 1.5 minutes and talk about some dual language terminology. The reason I want to do this is because the terminology in dual language means different things to different people, and it means different things in different districts. So I am going to really talk around what it means specifically in Denver Public Schools, but it potentially means the same in the district that you're coming from as well. So when we're talking about program type, there are really 3 versions of program type in DPS. We have one-way programs, two-way programs, and immersion programs. What that means is that our one-way programs only enroll students who are speakers of the target language. So in our case, it's Spanish. So in our one-way programs, we only enroll Spanish speakers in that program. In our two-way programs, we enroll speakers of the target language plus English speakers and speakers of other languages. So basically, that's where the two-way comes from. We have 2 different groups of students who are learning 2 languages at the same time together. In Denver Public Schools, immersion programs are our programs that serve mostly English-speaking students. There are some Spanish-speaking students and speakers of other languages, but for the majority of students, English is their home language. When we talk about program model, any of our program types can have any of the program models. So program model is just the amount of Spanish versus English, or the amount of the target language, if anyone here is in a school that has a language other than Spanish and English. 90-10 just means that they start 90% Spanish and 10% English, and then it gradually, the amount of Spanish decreases and the amount of English increases until it's 50-50. That usually happens around 3rd or 4th grade, depending on the school. 50-50 programs mean that from the beginning, when students enter the program, 50% of the instruction is in the target language and 50% of the instruction is in English. A one-way program, a two-way program, and immersion programs can use either of these program models. A lot of schools sometimes do a modified 80-20 in DPS because we have to have 45 minutes of ELD. Most of our programs are closer to 80-20 than they are to 90-10. So that was just a quick overview of some terminology so that when I start talking, since I live and breathe dual language, I just want to make sure you have the same information that I have when I'm talking about it. So now we'll go ahead and jump into several strategies that can help students as they navigate dual language in a remote, in-person, live streaming situation. And the one we're going to start with, because it is probably the question I've gotten most often this year, and also I think the most important, is staying in the target language. So if you are in a dual language program that's Spanish-English, more often than not, especially in the early grades, the target language is Spanish, and staying in the target language is super important. So there are a couple of reasons it's really important to stay in the target language, even though it's always been hard and now in a remote setting, it's even more difficult, is because for many of our students, the only Spanish they get or the only target language time they get is in school. And so if we are not adhering to our school's program models and our language of instruction, it's super difficult for students, whether they are remote or in person, to learn the content as well as learning the language at the same time. So it is essential for all of our programs to stick as closely as you can to whatever your program model says for language of instruction. And so what we're going to do is talk about several strategies that will help you stay in the target language and will help students also learn as they go in the target language. So the first one we know that's super important is visual supports and gestures. So I have a video to show you around comprehensible input. I'm hoping no one in our group speaks Serbian tonight, but if you do, don't let anyone know what she's actually talking about. So it's about 5 minutes, we'll take a minute, and Valeria, if you can give me a thumbs up if you can hear it, that would be awesome. Oops.
Zdravo. Uzmi jedan papir. Podeli na pola. Uzmi makaze. Iseči papir na pola. Na jednu stranu napiši tvoje ime. Na drugu stranu nacrtaj odakle ste ili gde živite sad. Dobro, uradite. So, I'm just wondering, were you able to understand the language that I was speaking to you? Chances are you didn't comprehend the language and the message I was trying to get across to you. I was actually speaking in Serbian. So I gave you some directions to follow, and I'm wondering if you actually followed them. Were you able to complete the tasks that I asked you to complete? You may or may not, depending on whether you know Serbian. Now I'm going to do the same instructions, only I'm going to give you some comprehensible input. And let's see if you're able to understand the message and follow along. Zdravo, zdravo, zdravo. Uzmite jedan papir. Papir. Uzmite jedan papir. Papir. Podelite na pola. Na pola. Podeli na pola. Uzmi makaze. 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 Iseči papir na pola. Iseči na pola. Iseči papir na pola. Na pola. Na jedan papir napiši tvoje ime. Moje ime Valentina. Napiši tvoje ime ovde. Valentina. Moje ime Valentina. Ti napiši tvoje ime. Na drugi papír nacrtit odakle ste ili kde živite. Ja živim u Texas. Ja živim u Texas. Valentina živi u Texas. All right. That was the same lesson given to you twice. So I'm wondering if you were able to follow along the second time, given some comprehensible input. In this book, Making Content Comprehensible for English Learners, the authors say that comprehensible input is much more than simply showing pictures as visual clues during a lesson. It involves a conscious effort to make the lesson understandable through a variety of means. So some of the means that I used while demonstrating the second time were pointing. I also used a slower speech and repetition. And I gave you opportunities to participate along with me as I modeled. There were other things I did too, such as nonverbals. I gave you affirmations and I smiled more, made you feel more comfortable, and hopefully allowed you to participate along with me. Now, making content comprehensible is not just for English language learners, it's for all students, those that struggle as well as any student. So if we're teaching something new to a student, for example, if we're teaching in a biology class or a social studies class and the vocabulary is completely new, when we make content comprehensible to students, it allows greater learning and success. Thanks for watching.
So as you can see from that video, the second time she went through it, I've seen this video multiple times and I still the first time through, I'm like, I'm not really sure what she's asking us to do. But the second time through, I'm like, oh, papier, okay, paper. So you start making those connections with language that you already know. I'm currently teaching ELD in a second grade classroom in person, and I have found visual supports and gestures to be super helpful for the students. In order for them to remember, for example, like past tense verbs versus present tense verbs and things like that have really helped them to be like, oh, it happened in the past. And so even simple gestures that you think about ahead of time really support students in even if they don't understand all of the words, in more or less understanding the content itself. So another strategy that's super important when it comes to our students in dual language and immersion classrooms, and really for all students, is slowing down. I am guilty of this. I talk really fast and I say a lot of things in very long, complex sentences. We need to be very conscious for our students that we need to slow down. And when you're talking, even if you think you're talking slowly, you probably need to slow down a little bit more. Especially in the beginning, it's super important to think about your pacing and how long and how quickly you are throwing words at students, let's just say. It's also really important to simplify your sentence structure. We really want to avoid complex sentences with lots of clauses, with lots of extraneous information. It's really important for students in dual language programs, especially in the beginning, to be very direct with your sentences and to keep the sentences relatively simple at the same time. So simplicity doesn't mean that we're simplifying the content. It doesn't mean that we are changing the content so that it is no longer grade level appropriate. What it means is we're simplifying the way we present it to students, but students, regardless of their level of language, can still be presented with grade level text. We just need to remember to slow down and simplify when we're talking to students. And we all know repetition is really, really important. On average, it takes a student about 14 times to hear something before they can incorporate it into their own knowledge. For language learners, it can be anywhere from 45 to 70 times that they need to hear a word or concept before it become cemented into their own language, especially if we're talking about vocabulary. If we want them to use the words, they have to hear the words a lot. And then they have to have opportunities to use the words as well. So repetition is super important. When I was teaching full time, I didn't realize how much repetition had creeped into my personal life until people started telling me, yeah, you already told me that. You already said that. Why are you saying it again? And it's like, well, because I have to repeat myself all the time to make sure that you understood me. So if it's creeping into your personal life, then you're probably using repetition about as much as you need to be using repetition. Cognates are also really helpful, especially if your program is Spanish and English. A lot of words, something I think in science, it's somewhere around 70% of words in Spanish and English are cognates. Cognates help kids place a word in their own knowledge, right? So if they hear that the word is the same thing in Spanish, so for example, factor and factor, then they'll be like, oh, okay. And they'll immediately start making those connections. So if you use cognates, that's a great way to keep yourself in the target language and to hold students responsible for using vocabulary in the classroom as well. We talk a lot about making learning relevant, giving them real world examples that they can connect to is a really great way to help them and you stay in the target language as well. I think that sometimes with real world situations, we're always like, yeah, they know about that, but they might not know it in a common way or in a shared way. And so it's super important to make sure that they have all of the information that they need. And if they already know a little bit of something about the situation that you're giving them, it can definitely help support their learning as well. Frequent comprehension checks is another great strategy. I do this a lot when I'm teaching ELD with the group that I have. They're all Spanish speakers. Frequent comprehension checks just to make sure, are they getting what it is that you're hoping that they're getting from it? Knowing that they will not understand everything, and that's okay. But are they understanding the main concepts that you want them to understand from that lesson? Giving them lots of feedback, especially around their oral language production, will help them use the language and understand how the language is used orally. When we talk about ELD, if they can say it, then they can write it. And so we want to make sure that we are giving students feedback on their oral production so that when they take that into writing, they take that feedback with them. And this is probably was the hardest for me as a teacher. And I know when teachers I talk to, this is really hard. You have to embrace the ambiguity. Students will not understand everything you say, and it's okay. Make that okay. What you want to think about when you're planning is, what is the 1 or 2 concepts that I really want every single student to understand when we finish this lesson, and focus on those. It would be really hard to do all of the strategies for the entire lesson, but what can you focus on for the 1 to 2 concepts that you want them to take away from the lesson? Most of the time, even in our own language, in our first language, or for simultaneous bilinguals in the languages we use at home, we actually don't really understand what everyone says anyway. We mostly just listen to people to hear the gist of what they're saying. And so it's okay for kids not to understand everything, as long as they are understanding the main concepts that you want them to understand from the lesson. Okay, and a note about leaving the target language. I get this question a lot from a lot of teachers. Is it ever okay to leave the target language? And the answer is yes. Emergencies usually are a wonderful time to leave the target language. So for example, if there's a fire drill, if there is some severe weather warnings happening, or if students are putting themselves in danger, please, please, please speak to them in whatever language you know they will understand everything you're saying. And whether that's both languages at the same time, or if they need you to switch to English, or they prefer you to stay in Spanish or another language, please do that. In general though, you want to stay in the target language as much as possible, and as much as your program's model indicates that you should stay in the target language. And the great thing about all of the strategies that I just talked about is that all of those can be done in a remote setting. You can add visuals and gestures in a remote setting. You can have frequent comprehension checks with students. You can provide them with feedback on their oral language practices. So all of these things can be done in both. Does it sometimes need a tad bit of modification for a remote setting? Absolutely. We are big fans in the MLE, formerly ELA department, of Google Slides. We use them for everything. I am using them to teach ELD. There is something really helpful for students about a picture that is showing them what it is that you're talking about versus trying to describe the thing that you're talking about. So showing them an actual photo of it is a great way for them to do it. And that can all be done remotely as well as in person. And if you're sticking around for the cafe, we can talk a little bit more around what specifically that might look like in particular grade levels or for particular content areas as well. Okay, moving us along, the next strategy that is really important when it comes to dual language and immersion classrooms, really all classrooms, is around building background knowledge. Background knowledge is sort of getting its new day in the sun, I want to say, when we talk about the science of reading, the move to the science of reading. It's getting its new day. This quote from Robert Marzano, I thought really sort of summed it up, so I'll give you some time to read it on your own. So we know that background knowledge is really important for our students. It helps them to make connections to their reading and to new learning, and it helps them understand their place in where they are in the new learning. But like this picture and this diverse group of fruit that we have here, students bring a variety of background knowledge to the classroom with them. And so it's really, really important that in the beginning of every unit, when it comes to certain lessons, that we as teachers are developing a shared background knowledge around whatever the topic is that we are going to be discussing. One thing that I remember from a class I was teaching is if we were talking about doing laundry, for example, we have a general understanding of what we assume everyone's background knowledge around doing laundry is, but it's actually could be very different depending on where you were raised, how you were raised, what doing laundry looks like. So even when there are things that we just assume everyone has the same general background knowledge, that might not be the case. So that's why it's really important to know that our students bring a lot of information with them, but we need to make sure we're creating a shared understanding around background knowledge. And there are a lot of different ways that you can do that. One of them is to teach words in categories. So this really thinks about thinking about thematic units. In dual language, thematic units are really popular because it supports students in learning about a specific topic. So they're repeating the same vocabulary and a lot of the same sentence structures over and over again. What teaching words in categories means is that basically if you're doing a unit on sports, for example, you let the kids know that you are going to teach them a bunch of words or a bunch of vocabulary around sports. Maybe it's specifically around the types of balls that are used to play the sport, or it's around the players, like what are the players called in the sport. Same thing with mammals. If students know that all of these words are mammals, they don't necessarily need to know what every single one of them is individually in order to know that they are all mammals. Right now, we can't take actual field trips, so virtual field trips and visits are a great way to encourage students to learn something new about a topic. In ELD, we're using EL Achieve, so the kids are on a virtual field trip. And in first and second grade, they go to the city. So last week we went to the museum. So I found them a video that gave them a tour of the museum because we can't go to the museum. There are lots of great websites for taking virtual field trips and visits. I believe Valeria put some of those in the note catcher for you. She did, thank you. So that you can check out some of those sites. Most museums will have some sort of virtual tour that kids can take. if you wanted to do something like that. It's super important to think about encouraging topic-focused wide reading. And what that means is that instead of kids reading a lot of books about a lot of different topics, they read a lot of books about one topic. And so if kids are super into frogs, really into frogs, then you help them find all the books that they can find about frogs, and they learn everything they can about frogs. What this does is a couple of things. Number one, it really builds their background knowledge around frogs and amphibians and potentially around habitats, but it also makes them experts and encourages them to want to read more. So maybe they want to learn about something new next. And this is a great way for them to do that so that they become experts about a particular topic, and that then builds their capacity to want to learn about another topic as well. Picture books for all ages are really great. I ended my teaching career in middle school. I think people as kids get older think that kids don't want picture books anymore. That's not true. Kids love being read to, adults love being read to, especially when there are pictures available for them to help them build that comprehension around what's happening in the story. I would say for any grade level, elementary, secondary, picture books and read alouds are still and always will be a great way to build background knowledge for all of your students. And then you can build in some literacy skills with that as well. Connecting virtually with experts is another great option. When I was teaching middle school science, we actually had Denver Water come out and explain how the filtration, like treating of water, works in the city and county of Denver. Since they can't come to us anymore, meeting with them virtually is a great way to do that. There are lots of websites that will help you find virtual experts who will live stream in or Zoom in and talk to your students about whatever the topic is that you are learning about. And I believe there's also a couple of options for that in the note catcher as well. Since we are in a new and uncharted virtual world, it's important to embrace multimedia. In Denver Public Schools, we use Seesaw for elementary and Schoology for secondary. And then we use a bunch of other stuff in those as well to help present information virtually and in person to students. Pear Deck and Nearpod are really popular with the teachers that I work with. And then always YouTube videos are super helpful for kids as well. So a 5-minute video could be a great way to help build background around the kids. Like I said, in ELD, this week we're at a parade. So I found them a video of the Parade of Lights from last year so that they could get an idea of what the Parade of Lights look like, since they won't be able to go to that this year. Okay, next we want to talk about student talk. Student talk is hard in the best of circumstances. In the virtual world that we are in right now, I would say one of the biggest questions that we get in our department is really around student talk. How do we encourage students to talk more, even online, because most of them are not in person at this point? And how do we get kids to talk even when they're in person, but they're sitting in rows and they have to be 3 to 6 feet away from each other? So first, let's talk about, why does student talk even matter? Why is it important? For the majority of our multilingual students, research suggests that they spend about 2 to 4% of their day in academic conversation, which I know when I was a teacher, I was like, they talk all the time, all day they're talking. But when we're talking about actual academic conversations, it can be as little to 2 to 4% of the day. And that's because as teachers, we like to talk. So we need to think of ways where we can encourage our students to do the talking, because if you're talking, then you're doing the learning as well. Another reason student talk is really important is because oracy builds literacy. If our students can say it, then they should be able to write it. The same goes with reading. If they can talk about it, then they should be able to understand it when they come across that particular topic or that particular vocabulary word in their reading. It's being able to talk to a partner first also helps our students decrease their affective filter. The more anxiety students have around talking, the less likely they are to talk. So it's always a great idea to have them talk to a partner first. If they are virtual and you are comfortable with breakout rooms, I think that you could potentially send them into breakout rooms to talk before asking them to talk whole group. Students really struggle sometimes to be cold called on, and we also don't want to only call on the 3 or 4 students who are the ones who always raise their hands. So if you have them talk to a partner before sharing whole group, then you know at least that all of the kids are talking at some point during the day, even if they're not the ones who are speaking whole group. Student talk also increases accountability and engagement. If we're standing up in front doing all the talking, you can slowly watch the kids disengage. I can watch that now with the 2nd graders that I'm working with. The longer I spend talking, the more I can watch them kind of falling off the cliff a little bit. But when I ask them to talk, they get super engaged and they're really excited to talk to each other. But it also builds accountability, because it's then, are both of you talking? Did both of you use the language? And now can we go through and see, by calling on 3 or 4 kids, who can use the language that we have asked you to use as well. And also because student talk is brain friendly. When they've done PET scans, when researchers did PET scans of people's brains while they were doing different activities, as you can see, when they had to explain something to a partner, large parts of the brain light up. And it's because in order to explain something to someone, you have to understand what it is that you're trying to explain to them. So while different parts of our brain are used for reading and decoding and things like that, explaining to a partner is where our brain becomes most active. And so we have this amazing resource that we are going to share with you. I'll open it up in a second, but it's student talk routines that can be used across multiple settings. We will actually practice some of these student talk routines during the chat when this session has come to an end. But I'm just going to give you a general overview of this document so that you can get an idea of it. Valeria, is it big enough?
It's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So basically what this is they have taken, in our department, we had some people put in some really serious work around this, but they took a whole bunch of different student talk routines and they described what they were and then talked about what that would look like to do that routine if they were in a remote setting, if you are in a socially distanced or physically distant setting, or if you are live streaming with your students who are in person and also online. This is such a great resource for teachers. Some of them are clearly more appropriate for older students. I would say 3rd and up, maybe 2nd grade and up, but there are some that will also work with kinder, ECE kinder and 1st graders or pre-K students as well. And what you will see here when we go into the session after this, we'll actually do some of these so you can see what they look like in a remote setting. But you'll also notice that if you click on, for example, one of the options, there has been created basically a template for you to do it. The great part is that it's in English and in Spanish. So if you're doing either one of those, you can do that. But it's been created so that it can be used in a remote setting or an in-person setting, because even if the kids are in person, they can't be sharing materials. And so having all of the kids write on sticky notes and then stick them up on the board isn't an option right now, but the kids could jot their thoughts on a virtual sticky note, and then everyone can read their sticky notes, whether they're in person or remote as well. So all of these options will be, there we go, here we go. So all of these options will be available, and there are quite a few different ones. We can talk more in the cafe around which ones might be appropriate for different grade levels. But the great news is that all of them have been thought of, and then there is a Google Slides version that you can do either in person or remotely. Because for example, like talking chips are really popular, but students can't share those. And so how can we change that into a virtual option where the kids aren't sharing materials right now? Okay. So let's start to wrap things up by talking about this. Let's start wrapping up this portion of the session by talking about how we can support families. This has been a rough year for families. I will say in my 12, 13 years of teaching in dual language settings and immersion settings, supporting families has always been one of the most crucial pieces, because families need to love dual language in order to keep their kids in it for the long haul. And they need to really understand that being in dual language is a long-term option for your students, right? For their students. They are choosing this knowing that they need to be in it for the long haul. And I would say what has made this year the most difficult is that parents have never had a front row seat to how hard things are for their kids when they are first starting out in a dual language classroom. They have had an idea, maybe the kids come home and they're really tired, or they're like, I don't understand, and they're frustrated, but they have never seen up close and personal what a struggle it is for their students in those first few weeks of school. And so parents have been understandably concerned about what's going on in a dual language classroom, especially if that classroom is remote and the parents are sitting right next to the students going, wait, what is happening? I don't understand what's happening. My student doesn't understand what's happening. And so we have a whole bunch of suggestions for how you can support families. I would say probably the most important thing that as teachers that we can do right now with our dual language families is to be honest with them. Like, this is really hard. And this year is even harder. And the kids' learning situations are totally different if they are remote. If they've had any in-person learning, that's been wonderful. If they haven't had any in-person learning, it's been hard. The kids are not getting the fully immersive experience that they normally would get during a regular school year. But it's also important to let them know that the students are getting the supports that they need. And really, and quite honestly, they need to trust the process because it works. And so the more honest you can be, obviously, professionally honest with them about this is really hard. And at the same time, you need to trust the process because it works. And are things not at all what we expected them to be this year? 100%. But we will make this work because this is a great option for all of their children. Dual language is the only bilingual programming that has been shown to fully close the gaps between our multilingual students and our English speaking students. And so they really just need to stick with it because it does get better and they will start seeing the results sooner than later. So talking about how they can, how you can help families, first, a few tips that we have found that really help to make families feel better, especially if they don't speak the language at home. If you're using Seesaw, there are lots of visual supports for Seesaw that you can include, including these icon shortcuts that are great if you want the students to write or record or draw, whatever it is. Throwing these into your directions are really helpful for families and for the kids as well. Using visuals and audio, we have found is also really important for families, especially our younger students. I would say our pre-K, ECE, kinder first, even our second graders. The directions almost always should be in both languages. Whatever that looks like can be a variation of things. You can do the written directions in English for the parents and record the directions in Spanish for the students. You can have the Spanish and the English directions both in writing and record the instructions in Spanish. We recommend that you record the directions for the students, whether you do them in English or in Spanish, but you always want to make sure that parents know what the students need to be doing, because that's one of the biggest issues that we hear from families is that they're like, I don't know what they're supposed to do, so I don't know how to help. By having the directions in a language that the families will also understand, it supports the student, but more than that, it helps allay some of the concerns from families. Sharing online resources. Parents are always wondering what they can do at home, how they can support, and we're going to talk about a few of the ways that they can help at home. Online resources are an excellent way for students to get more of the target language outside of school. A lot of these are apps that students can use. The majority of them are free. For example, Duolingo and Rockalingua. For Duolingo, they can do English or Spanish or another language. I would say that's probably most appropriate 2nd grade and up. My niece used it as a 1st grader and really liked it. But I would say probably 2nd or 3rd and up would be the way to go with Duolingo. Rockalingua is actually for younger students. I would say ECE through 2nd grade specifically is a great one for them to learn Spanish through songs and games and things like that. And then some of the other ones are just reading websites where students can read books in multiple languages. Tumble Books is really popular with elementary kids because the books they can read in Spanish or in English, and they can be read to as well as reading the books. So sharing online resources is always a great way to help parents feel more involved. One way that we have seen that has been super successful is actually having a newsletter. Whether that goes out weekly or monthly, I think is going to depend on your capacity as a teacher. But what has been super helpful for families is for them to get an idea ahead of time around what the students will be learning for that week. It doesn't need to be anything long or in depth, but it could just be like, here's what we're going to be learning about this week. Here are the 5 vocabulary words that we would like for students to know. Here's what they are in Spanish. Here's what they are in English. If you can practice them at home during the week, that would be great. Here's our read aloud for the week. Here's a video of the read aloud in Spanish and in English if it's available. If not, here's the read aloud we're doing. Here's a video of it. And then here's in general what the story is. Families have felt much more at ease and felt like they were much more part of the program when they had a general idea of what the kids were going to be doing for the week. It has helped to lower some of their anxiety around not being able to help their children because they don't speak the language. You might also be getting this question a lot. How can you help? They're always like, what can I do at home? What do we need? Do we need to, hire tutors, or do we need to be watching videos? Should I be trying to use my high school Spanish with my student? Like, what can I do to help? So there are a lot of things that families can do, even though they sometimes are like, it has to be harder than that. It actually doesn't. So we're going to talk about a few of the things families can do to support. I would say the first thing, which I tell families all the time, is to stop comparing their emerging bilingual student or emerging multilingual student to other students who are in one language only. Their progress and their learning looks different. And so if they're comparing their child, their emerging bilingual child, to either older siblings who are not in bilingual programming, or they're comparing them to the neighbor's kids who are not in bilingual programming, that's always going to terrify them a little bit. Their progress is different because they're learning 2 languages at the same time. And so I think it's super important for families to stop comparing their children to other children who are not in a similar situation. The most important thing that families can do, if they do nothing else, is read with their kids in their home language. They don't need to be trying to learn Spanish to read to the kids in Spanish. They can read to them in English, or they can read to them in Arabic if they speak Arabic at home. It's the most important thing that they can do as family members is reading with their children, because oftentimes books use more complex vocabulary, more complex sentence structures than we do as adults in our daily language. So it's important for kids to start getting a sense of that relatively early on. And when their kids are old enough, starting in 1st or 2nd grade, having their kids read to them or doing a shared reading where they read a page and then their child reads a page. Then they start hearing the language coming out, and the students don't have to be reading to their families in the language they don't understand. They can continue to read to them in either English or Spanish. But just that shared time for them to read together to show that reading is important and we are learning together is a really excellent way for families to support their children. Talking to their kids, also a great way for them to support children in a dual language setting. Really, I feel like this applies to any classroom setting, but really sitting down and talking with their children. How was your day? What did you do today? Really sort of getting into that deep conversation around building vocabulary and talking through their day. I mean, it's a great way for kids to summarize and do cause and effect and really think through decisions and things that happen during the day by having those conversations with their children. And I know it gets harder as they get older. My niece is 7. You ask her how school was and she says, fine. So it's really around also then thinking about the types of questions we're asking children. So instead of like, how was school, changing it to like, what's something you learned today? So I think that even when we're saying something that seems simple as talk to your kids, it's also helpful to give parents ideas around what they can talk to their kids about. So potentially if they're reading with their children, they can ask them questions about the book. What happened in the book? What's something that you learned? What is a connection that you've made? Do you want to read more books about this particular topic? Where do you want to go from here? What is your point of view? You know, if the kids are willing to talk to you about something that's happening at school, asking, okay, how could you have handled that differently? Or what is something that you can do next time? Or really getting them to think through some of that more reflective language will really support students in dual language settings. And having students write. We talk a lot, and I think it's been really hard, especially with a lot of students being remote right now, that potentially they're writing on Seesaw, but they're not actually taking pencil to paper, which is really important for our youngest students, our K2 kids specifically, is putting pencil on paper and writing. A simple way for families to do this with their kids, no matter their age, is to have something that Valeria and I use through one of our trainings, which are like interactive journals. And basically what happens is the student writes about whatever they want, and then the parent would respond. You can do it in your classroom as well. You learn a lot about kids through their writing. My friend used to be a high school teacher, and she would say the things you learn about kids through their writing, they would never tell you in person. And so writing has a lot of power when it comes to helping our students progress in terms of language learning, and also just progressing as writers as well. So families can encourage students to write, whether that's in a journal, in a diary, or some sort of interactive back and forth. Maybe they write notes back and forth to each other. It's a great way for families to be engaged in their child's learning and to see how they're progressing as writers as well. Okay, so thank you so much. We've ended just a couple of minutes ahead of schedule. Hope that's okay, Valeria, but thank you so much for coming to this session. I appreciate all of you being here on a Thursday. I guess it's evening now because it's dark outside, but thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Heather. In the chat, we've had a lot of people appreciating all your expertise and the resources that you're sharing. So thank you so much. We did have a couple of questions, and I don't know if Paulina, you want to jump in. I know you've been monitoring the chat. If people want to stay for a couple of extra minutes, we have a couple of questions. I know I saw one about specific strategies that you might want to recommend for simultaneous bilinguals, because we know a lot of it, it's like two-way and students learning Spanish as a new language, but what about students who are proficient in both languages?
Absolutely. So I think for me, when I think about that, and I think about myself back when I was full-time teaching, when you're doing your planning, it's a great idea to plan for your Spanish speakers and your simultaneous bilinguals first. Plan for them first. What supports do they need? What language do they need? And then you go back in and build in supports for your students who don't speak that language. So for your English speakers or your speakers of other languages, for example. I would say a lot of that starts with planning and thinking about it in terms of that. In looking at the student collaborations and student talk, I think there are ways to group students so that you are asking them to do more complex speaking and writing than you are potentially asking from some of your other students. I think differentiating your sentence stems and your sentence frames is also a great strategy moving forward. Even if some of the kids are only saying something like, we sat on the sidewalk, well, you have a different group of students who already have that language. So how can they expand on that language? While we were sitting on the sidewalk, we talked to our friends, you know, something along those lines so that the language is building for them.
Great, thank you.